Eagle Song, Chapter 3, The Great Peace. This is the story that Danny's father told. It was long ago. It was time when our people had forgotten the original instructions of our Creator. Be good to each other, our Creator told us. Live together in peace, but we had forgotten. Now our people fought with each other, the Mohawk and the Onondaga, the Cayuga and the Seneca and the Oneida were always at war. It was nation against nation, and within our nations it was village against village. And if one man was killed, then the other men of his village would seek revenge in a blood feud, taking a life for a life. The sun itself loves to see war, our people said. That is why we have such power. And they continued to fight with each other. Now among our people there was one man who wanted peace. His name was Hiawatha. He was a Mohawk, but he left the Mohawk people when his sister died. He mourned her death, but the Mohawk people were so used to war and death that they made fun of him in his grief. So he took his canoe and went to the coast toward the lands of the Onondaga. I will comfort others who are filled with sorrow, he said, because no one will comfort me. Hiawatha had a family, a wife and 7 daughters. He worried about what things would be like for his children's children, so while he lived among the Onondagas, he spoke of peace. But the Onondagas were ruled by a man who was a sort of a monster. His name was Tadodaho, and his mind was full of evil thoughts. His thoughts were so twisted that he had snakes growing from his head. His body was so twisted too, so that he was crooked 7 places in his body, and he had killed many people with his wizardry. He was so evil that he could make birds fall dead out of the sky. Hiawatha was a great speaker. When he spoke about peace, the people of the warring Onondaga towns came to the council held in his house and listened to him. His words were good. Now, the people said, we must do something about Tadodaho. We must pacify him, for he continues to kill people. We cannot have peace as long as his mind is not straight. That is true, Hiawatha said. I shall go to Tadodaho and tell him about peace. Tadodaho lived in a nest made of reeds in the swamp on the other side of the lake. We shall do this, Hiawatha said. We shall go by canoe across the lake. But as soon as the canoes were in the lake, the loud voice of Tadodaho was heard across the waters. A storm is coming to wash over you! And as those words were spoken, a great wind came, and the waves rose, and the canoes were turned over. Many people drowned, and the others swam back to shore. Once again, the people tried to reach Tadodaho to have peace to him. We shall walk around the lake to come to Tadodaho's place, Hiawatha said. But as they walked around the lake, the loud voice spoke again, and the ground became marshy and the people could go no further. Each time they tried to reach the monster Tadodaho, they failed. Then a terrible thing happened. One by one, Hiawatha's daughters died by the evil magic of Tadodaho. Now Hiawatha was filled with grief. He did not know how to rid himself of his sorrow. He left the lands of the Onondaga and began to wander. First he went south, up Onondaga Creek. He crossed over Bear Mountain and camped at its foot. That night he heard a song. Hi, hi, awa wee wo, hi, hi, awa wee ho. So the song began. Hi, hi, it is good indeed. Hi, hi, it is good indeed. Its words were words of peace, and he put that song in his heart and held it. The next morning he climbed the mountain. There he saw a wonderful sight. A corn plant was growing there on the mountain top. It had 4 roots and 5 stalks, and on each stalk were 3 ears of corn. A great turtle with a red and yellow belly was dancing there near the corn plant, dancing the dance which we now call the Great Feather Dance. I heard singing last night, Hiawatha said. I was the one who sang, said the turtle. This is the great corn. You will make the nations of the longhouse like this. The 5 nations will grow from one plant, and the 4 roots will stretch to the north and the west, the south and the east. Then Hiawatha put what he had seen and heard into his heart, and he continued on his way till he came to a group of lakes on a hill. There on the lake closest to him were so many ducks and geese that the surface of the lake could not be seen. Why are so many of you here? Hiawatha said to the birds, and the sound of his voice they followed. All flew up at once and carried with them all of the water from the lake. Then Hiawatha walked across the dry lake bed, where there were many small shells. As he walked among them, he thought of his grief, and he began to pick up the shells and place them in the deerskin pouch that he carried with him. When he had gathered many shells, he continued on his way for 2 more days until he came to an old abandoned cornfield and a shelter roofed with cornstalks. He made a campfire there. Then from the fibers of dried plants he made strings, and on the strings he placed the shells. When he had made 3 strings of shells, he put 2 poles in the ground and laid another pole across them. Then he hung the tree strings of shells on the pole and sat there and began to talk to himself. He talked about his grief and how it might be lifted. He bowed his head and talked about peace. Now, as Hiawatha had traveled from place to place, he had heard of a man who was among the Mohawk people. This man, it was said, was a messenger from the Creator. People called him the Peacemaker. His coming had been foretold in a great dream which had been sent by the Creator to all of the leaders. In that dream they were told that the word of peace would be brought to them by a man who was a holy messenger. But even though the peacemaker carried a great message, people were not listening to him. He was not a good speaker because he had been born with a double row of teeth. So when he spoke, his words did not come out clearly. As Hiawatha spoke to himself the words of peace, he began to understand. One man alone could not bring peace. It had to be done by people working together. I must find the peacemaker, Hiawatha said, and he turned toward the lands of the Mohawk people. Each night he camped and made a fire and hung the 3 strands of shells from a pole. Each night as he sat, he spoke of peace and said these words. If I should see someone in grief, I would lift these shells from this pole and console them. The shells would become words, and the darkness would be lifted from him. At last, the smoke from his fire was seen by the chief man of another village. A messenger was sent. When the messenger returned and told of what he had seen, a man sitting by a fire speaking of peace and the way to lift grief, the headman understood. This is Hiawatha, who has left his home at Onondaga. We have heard of him. He is the one who will meet the great man, the peacemaker. This too was foretold by the dream. So the headman sent a messenger, and Hiawatha was brought to the village. There he stayed until word came to them about where the peacemaker was waiting. They traveled many days, and when they came to the peacemaker, The great man rose to his feet and said to Hiawatha, "Younger brother, I see that you are suffering." Although the peacemaker's words were not clear spoken, Hiawatha understood them. He told the peacemaker of his grief. The peacemaker listened to his words and took the strings of white shells that symbolized Hiawatha's many troubles. "Now, younger brother," he said, "I shall lift your sorrow from you." So it was that the first condolence was done, and the first wampum strings were used by our people. The peacemaker and Hiawatha formed the plan for a great league of peace. The nations which had been at war would join together. They worked together for 5 years, establishing the great league. Then they returned together to Onondaga. Adodahon, who had done all he could to work against his league, knew they were coming. He hid himself so that no one could find him. But among the Onondagas were 2 men who could transform themselves into animals. One of them became a bear, and the other became a deer, and they went into the forest to seek Adodahon. When they came back, they said, "We have found Adodahon. He is terrible to see. His body has 7 great bends in it, and his hair is filled with snakes." Then the peacemaker and Hiawatha went with a great multitude of people to the place where Adodahon was hiding. As they went, they sang the peace hymn which Hiawatha had taught the people, the song given by him, the great turtle. Their powerful song pierced the air like the cry of the eagle, and they came at last, singing the peace hymn, to Adodahon Lodge. Hi, hi, agua-wee-ho, hi, hi, agua-wee-ho. They sang to heal the mind of Adodahon, and when he heard the hymn of peace, he could not move. Then the peacemaker and Hiawatha entered Adodahon's lodge. The peacemaker held out his hand and straightened Adodahon's body. Hiawatha combed the snakes from his hair. With his body and his head healed, Adodahon stood and joined them. Together they dug a hole in the earth and threw the weapons of war into it. Then they planted a pine tree there. The 4 roots of the pine tree stretched to the north and the west, the south and the east, just like the roots of the corn plant that Hiawatha saw. That tree stood for their League of Peace. Its roots were white like the path of peace, and it was said that anyone could trace those roots back to the pine tree and sit under its branches in peace. On top of the pine tree they put an eagle to keep watch and see if anyone was going to threaten the peace. In its claws the eagle held 5 arrows, which stood for the 5 nations of our people. Alone, you can break 1 arrow easily, but when you tie 5 arrows together, it is hard to break them. That is the way we would be. United, we would be strong. Together, we would work for peace. So the Great League of Peace was formed by our Iroquois people long ago. Richard Bigtree paused. "You know what happened to Adodahon?" Danny opened his eyes, almost surprised to see their apartment around them. "No," he answered. "They set him up as the head of their great league. To this day his name is passed down to the Onondaga chief who was chosen to head the great council meeting. You see, son, we believe that a bad human being can be made into a good human being. They can even become leaders, so they can use their energy to do good instead of bad. That is our way." Danny thought of Tyrone and Brad. "You going to tell that story to my class?" "Think I should?" "I like that story. I think they need to hear it in my school." "I think so too," Richard Bigtree said, running his fingers along the wings of the eagle of peace painted on his hard hat.